Hi guys, today's lecture is going to be circling back to the first of those 5 choices that we covered in our first lecture, acting on the important. So what we're saying when we are exploring the concept of acting on the important is the choice 1 is you want to act on the important, not react to the urgent. The door on the left is indicating someone who is reacting to the urgent, and the door on the right is someone who is acting on the important. So a paradigm is how you see and understand the world. In other words, it's a mental map. Take a couple seconds and just think about what your paradigms are and how you look at the world and how those might be different from other people's. People who choose this white door on the left have a paradigm of reaction. Everything is urgent and they become slaves to whatever urgencies come at them. And people who chose the door on the right have a paradigm of action. They are free to choose for themselves how they want to invest their resources. So the principle we're going to be looking at is discernment, or the use of insight and understanding in making a choice. So we're going to focus on the first behavior, discern the important from the less important. This is a diagram of the brain, sagittal cross-section, which you will learn about when you get into A&P and the nervous system. And the acting part, or the green door, is what happens in the prefrontal cortex, indicated by this area up here, kind of in your forehead. This is where planning, attention, self-control, choices, and follow-through occur. Now back in here in the medulla oblongata, the brainstem, and the pons, that is where the reaction, or the primitive and emotional brain, is located. This is reflexes, instincts, emotions, reactions, and impulses. What I would like you to do now is take out a piece of paper and divide it into 4 quadrants and label them as such. There's going to be Q1 in the upper left, Q2 opposite that. Below Q1, you're going to have Q3, and Q4 is the last one. So I will give you a few seconds to go ahead and get a piece of paper, a pen, and make a grid and label it Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this. Q1 is where the necessity, the crises, emergencies, last minute stuff, and pressing problems that come up. Q2 is where we want to spend as much of our time as possible, and Q2 is the quadrant of extraordinary productivity. That is where your best work takes place. Your goals you've set for yourself are taken care of in Q2. Creative thinking, planning, prevention, building your relationships, and learning and renewal and self-care. Q3 is when you're slipping into distraction. These are interruptions that don't have to be there, irrelevant, wasteful meetings, and dealing with other people's problems instead of working on your own Q2 issues. And unimportant emails, tasks, and all those other things that distract us. And Q4 is the absolute place where you want to spend as little time as possible, is where you're just wasting your time. And this is the big one right here, doing activities that are avoiding the things up in Q2. That's taking too much time off, too much television, gaming, surfing the internet, and those types of things. So let's first take a look at quadrant 1. What compels you to head into quadrant 1? And why do you think you might enjoy urgencies and emergencies and that working under pressure feeling? We are, at our base, wired for emergencies. This is things like threats. This is when adrenaline is released, and it can actually be physically addictive. And we are going to learn about the physiological basis of adrenaline later in our A&P lectures. This is what's known as the fight or flight response to situations. If we take a look at Q3, what would compel us to end up in Q3 and being distracted from our goals? And what activities can we do to get out of Q3 and move into quadrant 2? And the last and the worst is wasting our time in quadrant 4. Why might you think you would end up in quadrant 4? A lot of times people will tell me they are avoiding the activities that they know they should be doing, so they end up wasting their time. And think about for a second or two how quadrant 2, the wasteful part of quadrant 2, is, the wasteful part in quadrant 4 is different from quadrant 2. What defines those two quadrants? So you can think about it as an investment. On the left hand is the time and energy that you are putting in. And on the right hand side is your return on that investment. So in Q1, when you have the necessities in your life, you're putting in the time and energy to deal with emergencies, and you're basically taking care of the emergencies, and it's a break-even situation. When you move into Q3, your time and energy is being put in, and you're getting very little return. You're actually getting less than you are investing in distraction. And lastly, or not lastly, but in Q4, you are wasting. You are putting time and energy into activities and getting absolutely nothing in return. So once again, what we want to do is spend as little time in this, and in this, and do what we need to do to move out of those areas and get up into Q2, quadrant 2. So when we talked about that survey in the last lecture that said that somewhere in the vicinity of 60% of the typical person's time is spent doing things that are important and 40% is wasted on things that are not so important. This is how that breaks out if we break that down a little bit. So you spend 30% of your time on the most productive priorities and about 30% dealing with emergency issues, about 25% being distracted, and a whopping 18% wasting time. So that's how that breaks out. We have 41.5% spent in the bottom part of our chart, and the rest of our time, the 52 to 60%, spent doing things that are either have to be taken care of or we've planned ahead for and made a priority. So this is a visualization of the graph, a little more fancy version of it. Don't worry about that. I'll make one of those available. If you do want to print one of those up and fill it out, you can. But just putting it on a piece of paper and labeling quadrants 1 through 4 is adequate for our purposes. So Steve Jobs said focusing is about saying no. And you can decide for yourself whether that works for you. A paradigm that we talked about earlier that might work for you might not work for someone else. So things that are important to you might not be important to someone else. So everyone needs to decide for themselves how they want to spend their time and energy and how they can prioritize that and put it in quadrant 2. So these are 3 steps in learning to say no to the less important in the moment choice. You need to pause, clarify, and decide. Once you hear the request, stop and think about it without being reactive. Don't agree automatically just because it's in front of you. Visualize the time matrix, the quadrants 1 through 4, and what level of importance, where you would slot that in, and which quadrant that would end up in. And what level of importance does that request have for your own priorities? So ask clarifying questions, then decide how you should respond. They could be, when does this really need to be done? Is there another easier way to get this activity done? And what is the potential impact of this activity on my most important goals? Which priority is important to me and my goals? Okay, so here's a scenario to think about, a case study. You just sat down to study for the night when a friend sends you a text and asks, can you run over for just a minute? I need your opinion on the new dress I just bought or the car I'm considering buying. You know that when you go to her house, it is always at least an hour commitment, even if the question is short. Your relationship with her is important to you. How would you handle this? Okay, there's a couple of ways about thinking about that. Most people would, if they're studying for a final, would have to say no. However, when we get up to decision 5 and self-care, there might be a situation where scheduling in some time for this friend and keeping that relationship healthy is very important to your self-care and feeding your energy levels. There's a couple of ways of looking at that, but ask those clarifying questions and see if at this time this is a request that is contributing to your quadrant 2 activities.